Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi everyone, welcome to the another episode of All Things Policy. I am Saurabh Todi. I have with me Shambhavi Naik. We will discuss about the global pandemic treaty proposed by the World Health Organization, a zero draft of which was introduced this December last year for public discussion. The WHO states are meeting in later this month to discuss this draft in detail. So just to give some background to this effort, as we all know, the COVID pandemic was a significant, a stress test for the global response system during pandemics, especially to the working of the WHO. It exposed a lot of weaknesses and also strengths that the countries could exploit and can also learn from in future. So as to be more prepared in future for something like this, the member states of World Health Organization, they agreed in December 2021 to negotiate like a convention agreement or a treaty that is now known as like a pandemic treaty to have a more structured system of how to respond and prepare the world for like pandemics. The focus is to ensure that the human-animal interface is properly surveilled to ensure that global pandemics don't arise. And if they do, we are prepared in terms of our funding, in terms of vaccines and other medical equipment. So as a follow-up to this decision, the WHO established a intergovernmental negotiating body which met between February last year to about July, and they had these discussions. And as a result, the conceptual zero draft was released last year. And Shambhavi, this is a very significant development, especially the fact that this treaty might be legally binding. So why do you think this is needed, and what do you think about? Do you think this is needed or this is an overreach?
First of all, I think the treaty has been laid out very nicely. It is quite comprehensive in both its critique of how events played out during COVID and also of what needs to be done. I think it is a little visionary in that sense. I think it doesn't always take into account ground realities when proposing some of its provisions. But I think overall, it kind of touches upon all the important points that might be required for fighting a pandemic if it happens again. I think one of my biggest takeaways from the treaty is that it keeps on calling for solidarity for achieving global public health. And though it doesn't say in the text, I think it kind of hints that the approach that was taken for COVID, which was charity, by a lot of the other countries, we will create COVAX to reach out to low and middle income countries, and it would be this equitable sort of solution, which did not really pan out because it wasn't a very inclusive effort to begin with. That is, I think, is something that this treaty brings out, because it keeps on calling out for solidarity, it keeps on calling out for inclusiveness, particularly of those who are more vulnerable. And that I really appreciate in this treaty. There are some parts of it which might be an overreach under a pandemic situation because of that. So the treaty basically is going to be applicable, I think, once a pandemic has been called. And obviously the WHO calls a pandemic. And one of the biggest issues that we have seen so far has been the timing of calling something a pandemic, right? With the 2009 H1N1, WHO was criticized for calling it out as a pandemic prematurely. It did not actually go to the extent that anyone would have thought at the beginning of the outbreak. And with COVID, they were critiqued for delaying the call for a pandemic. So because the definition itself is a little hazy, the power that this treaty will give if it's passed its current form is going to be extremely hinged on what the definition and then who calls the pandemic and where it starts, etc. So I think that needs a far more discussion than what has been given even in the treaty draft, right? But the general flow of things, of stressing that that countries where there were not enough vaccine manufacturing capacities really suffered through COVID-19, and trying to kind of mitigate that situation from happening again. I think that's a crucial point. So stuff about global supply chains, about having more research and development. I think there are some really good points that will require further fleshing out. I'm not sure a lot of private sector companies will be on board with some of these, but we'll have to see how those negotiations go. But I think as a starting point, this is really it's a good draft of things that have to be discussed at the table.
Okay, so we will go to the specifics in a bit. So, like as a quick takeaway, I mean, what do you see are one of the weaknesses of this effort in the sense? I mean, do we need a treaty, or do you think that the existing structures that WHO has, can they be sufficed and can they be strengthened? Because there was huge backlash against WHO that the existing mechanisms did not work as they were supposed to. So is this treaty a response to strengthen them, or is it just like doing something new in response to a crisis and not really strengthening what we already have?
I think for me, the treaty is a discussion starter. I don't think the current mechanisms we have at WHO or any of the multilateral fora actually work, because I'm not quite sure how we can make them work, because we cannot decouple them from political realities and who's funding the said organization, who's calling the shots the said organization. So I think a lot of things are not cannot be strengthened through treaties anyways, and particularly for pandemic. I mean that in times of humanitarian crisis, I'm not quite sure which nation will not look to its own people and protect its own people and stand up for global cooperation. I think from a health perspective, the biggest weakness I see in this treaty is that it is limited to pandemics, which means you are already under stress, which means you already have low supplies of one thing or the other, which means that you're already trying to close borders, which we saw with COVID. And in that situation, then to try and build up supplies, then to say that we have to give out to others is difficult. I think what we need is a recognition that strengthening for pandemic or pandemic preparedness can be done before a pandemic. It is going to be very difficult to do it during a pandemic. And therefore, the treaty should also cover measures, strengthening, etc., that have to be done pre-pandemic. It might be there might be fear that it's a sunk cost, but I think it's well worth the cost.
Okay, so let's come to specifics. So, as part of the zero draft, the treaty proposes that there should be a global supply chain or logistics network, which they call the WHO Global Pandemic Supply Chain and Logistics Network. So, how do you think this could take shape? I mean, do you have any suggestions, or do you think that there are certain examples that we can take inspiration from? And given that India is one of the biggest suppliers of vaccines, do you think there is a role for India to take a lead in this?
Yeah, definitely. I think first thing that actually the WHO can work together on is standards. Right, a lot of the PPE, apart from in vaccines, we obviously know India has been a big exporter of. WHO is one of our customers. There, I think we have better understanding. But things like PPE, gloves, etc., which during COVID, I think we actually struggled to first find. Then India releases standards for PPE, and then people could manufacture it domestically. But general international consensus on the standards might help also then bring transparency to the process, the manufacturing process, and what can be exported, etc., and what India should focus speaking on, right? So I think just that process itself might bring in a lot of clarity. But the other, as I was saying, is that we need to build up stocks when we are not in the midst of a pandemic. And here I think the WHO could help through funding also. So I think one of the things that they mention in a later chapter, not in Article 6, is about allocating 20% of real-time production of a country to the WHO for equitable sharing. That I found was a particularly loaded statement, because real-time access to 20% of the production line it means that at that point of time you might not be able to expand efforts very quickly to allocate that 20%. So you're not increasing, you're just basically giving away part of what you might need. And if you think it from an Indian perspective, where we have a pretty high population that we also want to protect and cater to, quickly ramping up that production might be difficult, right? We saw this also in COVID, that it took a while for the vaccines to come in, etc. So having Some of these countries, some of countries like India, increase their domestic production capacities from before a pandemic strikes. Might be a good way of incentivizing more manufacturing, and obviously can be manufacturing other things. You don't have to. It might not be COVID again, right? So the capacities might be for different things, but we need to diversify our manufacturing capacities.
So would you say that, I mean, if there's this requirement and then if this gets accepted, that 20% of the production is to be kept aside for, like for global equitable distribution. So if there is some push towards ensuring that there is a fund that the WHO has, and the financing from that fund should be used to increase the production by 20% globally, to ensure that this requirement of 20% does not create a supply or demand shocks. Because I think having 20% of global production as like a quasi reserve is a big shock. And I think how do you think that is going to work?
Yeah, I think we need better clarity on what they actually mean and how this will actually work. At what point of time can they actually come and tell a party that, hey, this is a pandemic, we don't think that you require all of your 100% of your capacity, we are going to now take away 20% and give it to X, Y, and Z because we think that X, Y, Z is in more need for us. I don't really know how that conversation will go. And what happens if a country then feels that, hey, no, at this point of time we think that in our future interest we need to keep up that capacity, right? So
we had this example, I mean, during COVID also. I mean, we had the vaccine Maitri program, and even if it was very limited, but I think at that point, even if a state wants to do something, like the public perception and everything is very difficult, because like only giving a few million doses, which was not as much as compared to the billions that we were needed and everything, there was a huge backlash in public also, like, why are you giving it? So I think, yeah, and just imagining that if during the height of COVID, if there was a requirement that we had to give away 20% of our vaccines, that would be a very difficult proposition for any government.
It would be, right. I think it is one thing to say that, hey, we are going to give this to our neighbors because obviously there is a public health angle in protecting our neighbors as well, as opposed to giving it to WHO, who might then distribute it. And obviously there's 20% going to come from a lot of places, right? So vaccine Maitri in that sense, I think, had some foreign policy benefits attached to it. But if you gave it to COVAX, which looks nice, but diplomatically, the benefits of giving it to a country like Brazil and saying that, hey, look, we are here for you, and then eventually using that as a brownie point later on from a foreign policy point of view, I think makes a lot more sense.
I mean, and especially during a pandemic, I think countries would want to make sure that they take the most advantage of the situation. And so to expect, like a very altruistic behavior. I mean, we saw even during COVID that the countries, everyone was like hoarding supplies, hoarding components, so it was a very difficult time. So
it is. And I think what is also more important is that just having production of the final product is not it, right? There's a lot of starting materials, the entire supply chain. So can we now say that, hey, I remember during COVID we had this time when calf serum wasn't coming in, and so we could not make vaccines. Can you now go and say that 20% of calf serum? I mean, it is, this one I think is going to require a lot of discussion on how this will be implemented, who makes all of these calls.
Yeah, because especially during pandemic, I mean, WHO still is like a world organization, and given that there was so much of like anger against WHO, I think countries might not want to give away that power to decide what to do with 20% of their stockpiles or their production to WHO. I mean, or maybe I think this treaty would make it like more structured. So I guess during pandemic, people didn't know what to expect, what not to expect. So maybe the learnings from this pandemic, and if having a more structured treaty organization might help to reduce some of the unsurety. But again, during an adversity, I think it's very difficult to assume that countries would just come together and help each other.
Which is why again I'm going to stress on the fact that we need to build up stockpiles, and it would be great if we have stockpiles. I mean, it would be ideal if you have stockpiles in all countries, but at least in the regional hubs, and that those stockpiles are built using international funding at a peace time. And then if for some reason we go back into a pandemic, there is enough ramping up of manufacturing anyways that we'll be able to cope the shocks demands.
So during the recently held the India held the Global South Summit, and as a result of that, I think India announced that this very special initiative that India would provide certain number of medical equipment and vaccines and these supplies to the global south in the need when there is a pandemic or something similar. So do you think this model can be replicated on a global scale? I think maybe as an extension of this treaty, where countries, as you recommend, like regional hubs, like one major supplier or a bigger country, both in terms of economy and in terms of industrial capacity, is able to like commit a certain number of supplies to the region. So that will help that like it is going to serve a role for public health, so that you are ensuring your safety and your region safety. At the same time, there's not much pressure on one country or one region to take care of the whole world.
Right. I think so. And I think the other thing that COVID taught us was that we have to diversify supply chains, right? We can't have a central hub and that's it. Because that is what happened, right? China is one of our manufacturing hub for a lot of things. And the minute China closed down, we suffered. I mean, not just on APIs, but even like corrugated boxes, etc. So when it comes to critical healthcare products, we really definitely need to have supplies all over the place. Because we just need to make sure that even if one country is not able to supply, we have regional hubs where at least temporarily we can be able to get products from.
So the treaty also talks a lot about the IP rights, and I mean we are already at the height of the COVID pandemic. The India and South Africa proposed like a TRIPS waiver for vaccines. So it took a long time, took a lot of negotiations, and at the end it was like a watered down version with specific exemptions. So I mean this has been a problem for a very long time. India, despite being a world's biggest supplier of generics, played a big role in HIV pandemic prevention. There's still a very very big discomfort that like India doesn't respect IP. So do you think this IP war, the IP discomfort, is going to stay even during these discussions, or do you think that the world has seen the light after COVID pandemic?
The world has definitely not seen the light. Look, I think my quibble with this is that I don't find any issues with the private sector making money, because the private sector is there to make money. Okay, let's just accept that without any ethical issues right there. I mean, the ethical issue is obviously that they don't need to make so much money. But a lot of the vaccines in particular were generated using publicly funded money. And when you have that product, then to say that, oh, we are now going to make profits on this is, for me, is something that I cannot agree with, right? But leave aside all of that, because that's not central to the discussion. The thing is that this will not pass, right? People will not be okay with IP waivers. People will argue that, hey, no, this is required for innovation. I think in the Doha Declaration of 2001 as well, even though they say that in times for public health crisis, you can have compulsory licensing, they still say that we recognize that intellectual property is core to innovation. I think to change that, we will require dramatic change in the way research and development works itself. A lot more public funding coming into that. And I mean, that can go either ways. I think no government can support unlimited research either. We need to have private monies coming in. But if they're always for profit, then we end up with the mRNA vaccine type situation.
So even if I think that is the case, I think even if you discount the IP aspect in terms of private companies, I think there's also a certain level of geopolitics that countries would like to play with this. So I think it's not only just the companies.
Yeah.
I think, for example, if your country is one of the biggest sources of high tech, like high tech vaccines, let's say mRNA vaccines or components of vaccines, which we saw that USA was the supplier of so many of our components for the Bharat biotech vaccine as well. So do you think, I mean, how do you think that geopolitics, I mean, I don't see that it's going to be much change because it's crisis. And so a country would usually look to maximize like the diplomatic fruits from the crisis. So do you think this IP discussion also has a very significant geopolitical angle to it, and not just pharma companies?
Yeah, you're right, it does. And I think it's quite sad that the death of so many people and the suffering of so many people has not changed our approach to global health at all. We are still thinking about this as 194 parties. We are not thinking about this as one WHO or one world, right? We are still thinking that the draft is full of parties. And I think until until and unless we change that approach itself, that health is a public good, that global health is a public good, and that it is a everybody's responsibility. Yeah, I don't see how this could
I mean,
change.
it's kind of sad, but like, I think to be like slightly pessimistic is that like if such recent suffering of so many people and countries and economies like suffering so much, if that has not brought out some change, the hope looks bleak. But at least I think the fact that the countries agreed to have a pandemic treaty,
Yeah,
and again a legally binding one at that, which is more significant because there was some opposition initially by some countries, like to have it under Article 21 of the WHO, like rules which would make it optional. But at the end, it seems like there is a broad agreement that it should be under Article 19, which is legally binding. So I'm curious, is
I
that
just found that I think just
yeah.
having even this article put in and having this conversation,
Yeah, it's
it is really good. I mean,
yeah.
it's a good sign. Hopefully, we'll reach that stage where people will agree that, hey, look, everybody's health is our health problem.
So like I also like going through the draft, it says that it focuses a lot on one health. This idea that, I think especially after COVID, that it's not just human health, it's human health, animal health, and then agriculture. So it's a combination of factors, and then we have to look at health more holistically. Do you think that is a positive step, or it is like we just don't know enough and we're just going?
So my personal view on One Health is that our One Health approach is also skewed to human health.
Okay.
We like to consider a lot of other things because they will impact human health. We want to look at animal diseases because we are afraid of what might jump to humans or what might affect our food. We are pretty selfish in that way. I think it's a good start. I think trying to monitor, stuff like antimicrobial resistance for animals, trying to see how I don't see a lot of plants in One Health.
Yeah, no, I think they have FAO, and I think it's more to do with food security than with like plant diseases per se. I think it's mainly zoonotic, which I think the COVID one just like made it worse, that like disease most likely jumped from an animal to human. So
for us, health and disease is us. And whatever can come to us, the secondary sources for that is important. Which again, I think as an approach is problematic, because what we should really focus on is a healthy planet. If it is really one health, one planet, then it has to be a healthy planet. We can't just pick and choose stuff that impacts us and go, okay, this is what we're going to look at. It is obviously in the short term, it is required. I think we can, if we are that selfish, it is required.
Plus, I think, maybe a bit like human centric, but yeah, I guess like the idea is that at the end, like countries care about their people.
Yeah.
People are humans. So it's like at the end, it's
People are human.
so I think essentially it's like it all boils down to like, how can I ensure that the health of my citizens or people at large is not affected? And I think unfortunately is that we focus so much on just human health, while disregarding so many other elements of.
But it's more, it's even more complex than that, right? Because for us, health is also an administrative topic then. So, to what level do you go down? I can say that I currently stay in Karnataka, so the government of Karnataka will say that, because you are in Bangalore, this is what applies to you. I might hop over the border, not that far away from the border, and Tamil Nadu might have different kind of things for the same topic and for the same person, which is, I think, this at some level we have to stop having this administrative mindset that we have, that we are responsible only for this and so we will do only this, and realize that if we don't just play a role as a species of the various species that are on earth, we are going to get into problems.
Yeah, true. Like, so the One Health, like in true sense, where One Health is health of everybody, not how everybody else affects human health. That I think that change is still like not there yet.
And because no one could have predicted. We still don't know where COVID has come from, like SARS-CoV-2 has come from. So you can't say that, okay, you can only get Nipah from bats and nothing else is going to ever come, and therefore we are not going to have any more diseases. So we'll just figure out the bat droppings in palm saplings and that is it, right? We can't take that approach to One Health. Yeah, one health has to be everybody's health.
Yeah, I mean, so in that optimistic note, that's the time we have. So hoping that, I mean, the discussions that are supposed to begin in a few days are fruitful, and I think there is a lot that this treaty expects the state parties to agree on. It's very revolutionary in some ways. In some ways, it has to like swim through hurdles like economic, political, and even like just logistical. So let's hope that this pandemic treaty is a signal that we have learned a lesson and we are going to improve.
Start taking steps into improving.
Yeah, so hopefully. So thanks again, Shambhavi, for being here. And thank you, listeners. We'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you all for listening in. So do listen into any of the discussions that you can for the draft. And if you have any points that you think are necessary that the draft might have missed, you can always feel free to write to us, and we will put them across to relevant people when we put out our stuff with an attribution to you. So please feel free to write in. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.